Okay, so now let's look at the microscopic component of your skeletal system and of bones. Now, the primary component of bone is going to be bone connective tissue or osseous connective tissue. When we're looking at this, when we covered different tissue types in a previous lecture, we know that there was epithelial tissue. There's connective tissues of which there's a variety of different types. Bone falls underneath that. And then there was muscle and nervous tissue as well. So let's look at the bone component of it. And the first thing that we should look at is what the definition of connective tissue is. And connective tissue is essentially made up of cells that reside in an extracellular matrix. And we know that that extracellular matrix is made up of a variety amounts of fibers and ground substance. Okay, so let's now look at the different types of cells located within bones, and then we can move forward from there. So let's look at this, and let's just start this with cells. Okay. And the cells within your skeletal system all originate from a connective tissue. Let me just put this one in a different color so it definitely is not associated with it. The different bone cells originate from an embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme. All originate, and that's an embryonic connective tissue. There's two different types of embryonic connective tissue, depending on the location and so forth. But for our purposes, just know that the bone originates from mesenchyme. And let me go to a different color here. And mesenchyme is a stem cell that will differentiate or specialize into another cell type. Okay, and this is going to be differentiating into another cell called osteoprogenitor cells. So osteoprogenitor cells. Okay. Before we go further, there are 4 cell types that's going to be associated with your skeletal system. So let me just put 4 up here. So this is going to be number 1. Okay. They all originate from mesenchyme. Mesenchyme differentiates into an osteoprogenitor cell. Osteoprogenitor cells will then further differentiate or further specialize into another cell type, which is going to be our second cell type, which is going to be called an osteoblast. So E-O-B-L-A-S-T. That differentiates into a cell called an osteoblast, and we'll talk more in detail of this one. The osteoblast will end up maturing. Okay, it gets trapped in different things. We'll talk about that in a minute. It gets trapped, and that changes into our third cell type, which is here, which is going to be called an osteocyte. So we have an osteoprogenitor cell, we have an osteoblast, we have an osteocyte. Notice that they all start with the word osteo, meaning bone. So we have osteoprogenitor, osteoblast, and an osteocyte. Those 3 either build, that's build, or maintain bone. Okay, so those 3 will either build or maintain bone in some nature. Okay. So now we have 3 different cell types, but as you notice, there's supposed to be 4. So let me put this one in a different color because it doesn't, the 4th cell type doesn't originate from the osteoprogenitor cells or an osteoblast or an osteocyte on this one. The 4th one is going to be called an osteoclast. Okay, so clast, C-L-A-S-T on that last one. And then that's a whole separate different type of a bone on this one. The osteoclast, basically, their function is to tear down or resorb bone. That's a B. Okay, so it tears down the bone. The other ones essentially build it up or maintain it. The osteoclast tears it down. So what we want to do here is let's look at a couple of these other bones, find out what they do. We know that the osteoprogenitor cells leads to an osteoblast, but I'm going to focus primarily on the osteoblast, osteocyte, and an osteoclast. And those are the ones that we're going to be really focusing most of our time on. And in a second, we'll also talk about the matrix. I tell you what, let me do this before we jump ahead. The osteoblast leads into the matrix, or it produces or manufactures the matrix. Okay, and so we'll get into that a little bit more. So for right now, let me pause this. We'll get this set up and we'll talk about the next step. Okay, so let's look at the osteoblast first. So here we're going to have osteoblast. Okay. When we're looking at an osteoblast, again, they are derived from, or they come from, the osteoprogenitor cell. Okay. These are roughly cuboid in shape, and they lie on the surfaces of bone. Okay. And they're usually kind of lined up next to another osteoblast. So these are lined up against each other. And the osteoblast will secrete a, let me just say this. They will secrete, we'll call it osteoid. O-S-T-E-O-I-D. Okay, it secretes osteoid, which is semi-solid. S-O-L-I, semi-solid collagen. Okay, semi-solid collagen. Okay, and this osteoid is actually the matrix. Okay, so let me go over here. This makes the matrix. So osteoblasts secrete osteoid. Osteoid becomes the matrix, okay, of the bone. So remember connective tissue. Connective tissue are cells that reside in an extracellular matrix. Okay, so osteoblast is the cell, secretes an osteoid, which is the matrix. Okay, that matrix is made up of a semi-solid collagen in this case, and the matrix actually will harden. Okay, the matrix hardens, so it's semi-solid, and then it hardens or calcifies. So let me not use the word harden, but it calcifies when salt crystals are deposited on it. Okay, it makes it's a little hard to understand, but try to visualize something for a second. Picture a slug in your garden. Okay, these slugs, as you see them crawling across your driveway or something, leaves a trail of slime. Okay, so think of the slug as the osteoblast. That slug is secreting osteoid, the slime. Okay, so you've got this trail of slime following the osteoblast, and salt crystals, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We have salt crystals that kind of deposit on it. Think of it's sprinkling outside, and the raindrops are the salt crystals. And when it deposits on that slime trail, the osteoid matrix, that will then harden up and calcify, which becomes the hardened bone that we can think of. Okay, so this slug is constantly moving, or this osteoblast is constantly moving over this cell or the bone layer. And imagine this slug getting tired. Okay, so it doesn't move as fast. or it slows down, but it continues to secrete the osteoid, that slime. And as that osteoid matrix is being secreted, it wants to cover up the osteoblast. So if you can see this, so we're moving along, the slug is moving along, it slows down, think of it that way, and the osteoid covers up the slug, but those calcium salts, those salt crystals, continue to deposit on the matrix, that collagen, that osteoid, and now the slug is covered up by the hardened bone, okay? And at that point, the osteoblast is converted into an osteocyte. Okay, so an osteoblast leads to the osteocyte. So again, think of that slug moving along, secreting that slime, osteoid. When that osteoid covers up the osteoblast, you have the salt crystals depositing on it, that hardens, and when the osteoblast is entrapped by that matrix, it then is converted to an osteocyte. Now, an osteoblasts and osteocytes can communicate with the cells that were adjacent to it. And even though the osteoblast has been covered up by that matrix, it still can maintain communication to its adjacent cells. And once the osteoblast is converted into an osteocyte, that communication tunnel, if you will, is called a canaliculi. Let me see if I can spell this one. Canaliculi. Well, we'll get to that in a second. Okay. So an osteocyte is a mature bone cell. Mature bone cell. Okay. And the osteocyte helps to maintain the bone. Okay. So osteocytes are sensitive to mechanical stresses applied to the bone. And if it starts noticing that there is altered stresses on the bone, it signals the osteoblasts, which then lays down new bone or more bone to address or accommodate that additional stress. Okay, so that's going to be an osteoblast, that's going to be an osteocyte, and when we get into the functional unit of the bone, we'll talk about how the osteocyte communicates with adjacent osteocytes as well. We have one more cell type that we're going to discuss, and that's going to be the osteoclast. So hold on, we'll do that next. Okay, so now let's look at the fourth cell type, and this is going to be an osteoclast. So let's look at osteoclast here. Okay, an osteoclast, as we said earlier, is involved with tearing down or resorption of bone. Okay, the other cells that we've talked about lead to building or maintaining bone. This one tears down the bone. Okay, so osteoclasts don't originate from the osteoprogenitor cell. It doesn't originate from an osteoblast or an osteoclast, but it does originate from the bone marrow. Okay, and essentially osteoclasts originate from different cells in the bone marrow that fuse together. So fused bone marrow cells. Okay, so let's say it originates from fused bone marrow cells. Okay, each cell has a nucleus. So now if we fuse multiple cells together, it's multinucleated. Okay, so we have multiple nuclei. So multinucleated. Okay, these are phagocytic. Now phagocytic, let's back up. The fused bone marrow cells, these are going to be similar to the monocytes. And when we get into the different blood types or blood cell types, Monocytes is a white blood cell that does phagocytosis. So it engulfs bacteria and it tears down different things. So these are going to be similar to this, where the fused bone marrow are similar to monocyte in origin, and therefore it's going to be phagocytic. So it's going to be absorbing something, or it's going to be tearing or breaking down something, okay? When we look at this, it's the basic shape. Let me do a kind of a different shape on this. Let me do this one. This is a very rough rendering of this. So let's say we have a an osteoclast. Okay, so this would be an osteoclast, and let me do the nuclei in here as green. So this is multinucleated. Okay, so, because bone marrow cells fuse together, so now we have multiple nuclei in here. It has a ruffled border on here, and let's do the bone in blue. B for bone, B for blue. Okay, so this is going to be the surface of the bone. It dips down, comes in, and does one of this. Okay, so an osteoclast can be located or resides in a depression or a pit within the surface of the bone. And we have this ruffled end. Okay, see, these are the ruffled ends, and it does it so we increase the surface area of the osteoclast. Now this ruffled end in this area will secrete enzymes that break down this bone tissue. Okay, this little depression, is called a resorption lacunae. So resorption, lacunae, L-A-C-U-N-A, lacuna. Okay, the pit or depression is called a resorption lacuna. And what happens is this osteoclast will secrete enzymes. Those enzymes drain out in this direction, and it will start to tear down or resorb this bone. Okay, and what ends up happening is that when it tears down the bone, it releases the calcium and phosphate. Okay, and we talked about this earlier. So if calcium and phosphate are broken down, that comes out and it goes, so calcium and phosphate go into your bloodstream. And when it goes into your bloodstream, then it raises up your calcium levels or phosphate levels to its normal level, what it wants. And that's going to be a homeostasis component on here. So I think those are your general components that I want to go through here. The next thing I want to do on this one, we'll touch briefly on the bone matrix, very briefly on how it hardens and what's necessary for that. So we'll look at those little brief components. So for right now, let's stop here, and on the next video, we'll go from this point and move on.